It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Lyon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza.
Hello, Irwin.
Our podcast, Our Hamptons podcast audience knows the subject we're going to talk about is something that Esperanza has subtly and sometimes overtly really said, hey, we really need to talk about this subject. So I'm really excited that we're going to be talking about it because it is something that really needs to be discussed. And Esperanza, what we're talking about is that section of East Hampton known as Freetown.
Yes, I am really looking forward to this conversation, Irwin.
Okay, me too.
It's as you like to say, it's a meaty one. Or am I thinking of someone else?
No, that is definitely my term. You know me well. I have used that on occasion. Because again, and our audience knows this by now, Esperanza. Some of the topics are lighter, but sometimes we get meaty, and this one's meaty, and it's a subject that really, it's a great subject to talk about. I think this podcast is going to be more of an overview for our audience. There are people and organizations that really delve very deep into this meaty subject. Allison McGovern, for one, the Plainside Project, which is David Rattray and Donna Marie Barnes' vehicle. So to really delve deeper, those people would really are probably the avenues. But for our audience, just to familiarize themselves with it, and I think we're going to provide value just by doing that. So, Esperanza, we should, I guess, start by really where Freetown is. It's this small little hamlet outside the village of East Hampton. So it's unincorporated, loosely defined as the area along 3 Mile Harbor between Jackson Street and Abraham's Path.
Right, 3 Mile Harbor Road, but I would argue it also, extends to between 3 Mile Harbor Road and Springs Fireplace Road.
Which, remember, at that juncture, at the southern portion, is much narrower than it does when it goes further north. So that's a short little jaunt from Freetown to go from 3 Mile Harbor Road to Fireplace Road. So that's basically where it is. It's Morris Park Lane. I mean, these are the areas.
Yeah, Neighborhood House Lane, Morris Park Lane.
Exactly. These are the neighborhoods we're talking about. And if we go back historically to 1790, we're getting this information, a lot of good information out of Columbia University. Wikipedia even has a good page on this, but in
Dr. McGovern, really. I mean, I think she's behind a lot of this information. She's researched it extensively and is an archaeologist.
Right. And Dr. McGovern has actually made presentations within the town over the years on this subject matter. So, but again, getting back to it, 1790, the census, there was approximately 1,299 whites, 99 slaves, enslaved people, if you will, and 99 people classified as all other free people. And this article goes on to say...
This is for the residents of East Hampton in general, right? That was the census record for East Hampton's residents.
This is how I'm reading it.
Yes.
And following, according to this, again, from Columbia University, following the passage of the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1799, John Lyon Gardiner and other wealthy local slave owners settled newly freed slaves in Freetown.
Yeah, there was the passage of the Gradual Emancipation Act in 1799.
That's correct.
So that was, sort of a quote unquote game changer, though. I mean, the gradual part of it is
Yes.
is the key word here. But right. I mean, I would say that Gardiner was one of the first as a slave owner who contributed to the establishment of Freetown.
Correct. And it should also be noted that some of these very early African American residents of Freetown actually assumed their owners' names. I mean, they had
Yes.
the last name of Gardiner, of Hedges, very familiar names on Eastern Long Island.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
and
Yep.
this goes on to continue. And again, this is just an overview so our audience sort of knows what we're talking about here. Throughout the 19th century, these African Americans were working as laborers. They were skilled tradespeople, really working in the industries that this community is known for: farming,
Right.
at sea, fishing,
Whaling. Yeah.
whaling, and
Yeah,
in
and I would add also, Irwin, I mean, this was, if you think, the connection between, and I know there's a quote that we came across from Robert Hefner, who was the historic preservationist for the village and the town for many years. It's the connection between Main Street and Freetown. And if you think about it today, with the the reconstruction of the Domini workshop, the Dominis were craftspeople. And so we're talking about people living in Freetown who also were craftspeople, because it wasn't, a handful of Dominis who were just exclusively the ones building the windmills or furniture. I'm sure that they employed or, had people working with them of color.
And it's an important point to note because to that very point, these were skilled tradespeople. These were not just this was not just menial labor we're talking about.
No, absolutely
to that
skilled.
precise
Yes.
point.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, and it's an important one to stress, to our audience. And talking about this community, and we're going to get more into part of the impetus for this was prior conversations we've had about Arthur Benson. We're going to bring him in a minute, but community life, it was about family, faith. There was a church there, St. Matthew's Chapel, which was right on 3 Mile Harbor Road. And Esperanza, we should really let our audience know that they can actually see St. Matthew's Chapel.
It's a bit hidden away, yes, but
hidden away, and
but it was moved from 3 Mile from its original location on 3 Mile Harbor Road on the north side. Yeah,
and it's sort of incongruous.
Oh,
to
completely.
Put it in perspective. I'm being kind, Esperanza, saying incongruous.
Well, today it's incongruous because its original purpose was not incongruous per se. It was moved to what is now East Hampton Point, but that was a marina, and it was really meant as like a sailor's chapel, so
right.
Yeah.
But now when you go into East Hampton Point near CC Restaurant and everything else, and you're seeing this, it's
a gym.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's used as a gym.
Note the silence, our Hamptons podcast audience.
Which, we have to acknowledge that it's at least good that it still exists, the structure,
and it's preserved,
fairly well preserved.
Yes.
It just doesn't have the pews and so forth, but the actual use of it is completely antithetical.
Completely true. But again, to take the good with the bad, as you just did, Esperanza, we're grateful that it's still standing in some way. So
yes,
we'll take that. But now continuing on with Freetown, and this is where we're going to, sort of bring Arthur Benson into it. It continued to expand its diversity into the 20th century and in the late 19th century. Now, Arthur Benson, we've discussed Arthur Benson in the past, very wealthy business owner. Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, didn't get his name from another Benson. It got its name from Arthur. Not to mention the Seven Sisters in Montauk, and that's, which is issues we've discussed in other podcasts. But Arthur Benson offered cash and deeds to small plots in Freetown to Montauk Indians, Montauketts, seeking rights to tribal lands and Indian fields.
Right, right.
So
Because already, as we've discussed, Benson had bought pretty much all of Montauk, or as it was known then, the Montauk Peninsula, 10,000 acres, according to the research that we have in front of us. And that's really, the Montaukett, that was their ancestral homeland. And specifically, as you just mentioned, Indian Field was then, you could say, given up.
yes, I mean, and we should also make mention, this land in Freetown, it was not really suitable for agriculture.
Right. That's a really good point.
Which is something we
Exactly.
right. I mean, it was while it was convenient. I mean, I guess Esperanza today we could use the term that it's village fringe,
It's
in
that's
terms of
exactly right. Let's use that realtor term.
yeah, let's
It's
use that
village
real estate.
fringe.
Yeah, let's use that. But it's so there was very good access, very convenient to the downtown area in East Hampton,
Or upstreet, as we like to call
or
it.
upstreeters, as we've spoken about in in prior uh, incarnations of our Hamptons podcast. But so but they did okay. But at least this was an area while that these people did own this property, although there was some in there that were renting. It should also be noted, and this is from Wikipedia, that East Hampton's elite white residents, quote unquote, continue to own the majority of the
Right,
property.
right, exactly. Which goes to your point of a lot of the working class people renting from the elites.
Exactly correct. So
Yes.
that's sort of where it is. And
Oh, and
Esperanza,
and and one thing, I mean, and I don't know date wise necessarily, but we have talked about Eastville when we've spoken of Sag Harbor with the Sands Historic District, and Eastville, I think we have discussed. And I would say there are some similarities between Eastville and Freetown, with the diversity of the population, because this was not just a Black, Indigenous, people of color neighborhood. There were white people as well. So it was really, there were lessers, and there was a mix of people. So that's a point to be made also.
yep, I have to say it's very funny you brought that up, because Esperanza and I always talk for a few minutes before we record a podcast. And I was saying to myself, there really is a connection with Eastville and Sands. I mean, we really,
Absolutely, there
and
is.
I
I
didn't
mean,
say
there's
that
the
to you.
there's the
And
Eastville Montaukett band,
yes,
and there's the Freetown Montaukett band. And these were the places where people, were then displaced people, basically, were able to settle and live and thrive and create, neighborhoods.
you know, and speaking about displaced people, since you just handed me that segue on a silver platter,
You're
as you tend to
welcome.
do. Thank you. I,
It's what I'm here for, co-host.
I'm eternally grateful for those segues. Sometimes, admittedly, we know it's coming, but this one really was an organic one, Esperanza. Very good. But I think it's a timely moment to really talk about the Fowler house,
Right,
which is, again, we could,
extends from the Benson history.
that's exactly correct. And just to give our audience who George Fowler was, George Fowler worked as a gardener and, yes, I'm not making this up, a gondolier for the artist Thomas Moran. We all know the Moran House, Main Street, East Hampton.
Across from Town Pond.
House from Town Pond, National Historic Landmark. And Mr. Fowler was also the caretaker at Home Sweet Home. And his house was part of within the property where Arthur Benson owned the Montauk Peninsula. And that house around 1890 was moved to Freetown.
Right.
Right?
I mentioned to you, Irwin, and I'm going to bring that information up, that this is such a wonderful resource, by the way. Also, the Long Island collection, they have digitized so much. And if you anyone can access. You go to digitallongisland.org and you put in Freetown or you put in George Fowler, and the most, astonishing documents, including photographs, come up. And one of the things that I found was the copy of the contract between Montauk Indians, including George Fowler. There were three: George Fowler, Maria Farrow, and Wyandanch Farrow, with Arthur Benson, and they call it the proprietor of Montauk Peninsula. They call him the proprietor. Where, there's the financial arrangement of the payment that the Indians, the Montaukett, were going to receive in exchange for 12 acres of land at Freetown, for the construction of dwelling houses. In exchange, said Indians release all claims to Montauk Peninsula. So truly, their hand was forced. I mean, yes, there was money exchanged, but we have to remember, like, for the indigenous populations, land was for everybody. It was communal. It wasn't, something necessarily that you would exchange money for. But they really, they gave it all up. They were forced to give it all up. I mean, my understanding is even there was a house that was burned down in Indian Field, so I'm sure there was no lack of threatening behavior for this to happen.
Now, that's a really important point you bring up, Esperanza, because the term communal, like for the Native Americans, and again, we're not a history podcast where we don't claim to have enormous expertise, in the real nuts and bolts of this, but land was communal. It wasn't about a development site, a parcel. This is my land for my house. It wasn't about that.
Right.
And, getting to this now, when Arthur Benson transferred this 12-acre parcel.
Right. And this was 1885. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that.
1885. And Arthur Benson transported the materials of the houses belonging to Fowler and his relatives to Freetown and their re-erection. It suggests that the Fowler family's dwellings at Indian Fields were basically dismantled.
This is what is mostly indicated in specific with the Fowler cottage or Fowler house, that it still exists along Springs Fireplace Road, is that little cottage was moved from, whether dismantled or as a whole, from Montauk to Freetown.
And to your point, which you stated, and it can't be understated, yes, while there was a transaction, they were pressured into doing this by, just transport yourself there, as we like to do on our Hamptons podcast. A powerful business owner, real estate developer like Arthur Benson negotiating with this community.
Yeah, culturally, it doesn't even make
sense. It just doesn't
even,
the Native American community wasn't about negotiating. That's not who they were.
It just was different. This whole, it's a transaction that was not a normal occurrence for the community of the indigenous populations.
Exactly correct. And it should be noted that this house that Esperanza was referring to it's actually relocated onto Springs Fireplace Road. The house was restored in some way, shape, or form, Esperanza. Am I correct? And when they moved it over there, it was
the Fowlers lived there for many years. So since the late 19th century, they lived there up until I think it was into the 1990s. And you have to think, this is a really small house. Originally, the original sort of little salt box house that you will see today, but they had added on to it also. So there were sort of wings that were added on as, life changed, the family expanded, etc. However, from what I have gathered from different conversations and research, there was no running water.
Right.
I think there was electricity, but that came along fairly late. So it was very much a very rudimentary structure.
Yes.
Really late into, not too long ago, if you will. And what happened was it just, I guess the family sort of abandoned it, or, they had not abandoned it, but they hadn't paid taxes on it. So the county um, took it over. And then subsequently gave it to the town of East Hampton. And that's when a group of people came together to get it designated as a historic site.
Right, right. And it's also believed to be the only surviving 19th century dwelling left from the Montauketts.
In Freetown, I mean, yes, I don't know for a fact, but definitely from the Montaukett uh,
Yes.
dwellings that were moved, yes, that seems to be the case. And unless, if anything, there might be archaeological remains of other houses, but yeah, this one is definitely one that still stands. And I think that's almost a testament to the family that lived there for so many years, in conditions that probably not a lot of people would have uh, lived in comfortably.
Correct. And, to bring Robert Hefner back into the conversation, again, a history consultant to the town a few years back, he put it in terms of the Fowler house completes the whole picture of the Moran house and Home Sweet Home. This really is a direct link, and that shouldn't be understated, that Main Street and Freetown are together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and, they're hoping for this to get on the listing of the National Register of Historic Places. I don't know if it actually has as
I
yet, but
believe I believe it is. But one thing I would point out is that in the, as you would call it, restoration of this structure, I mentioned these added appendages to the house as life evolved.
yes.
And what happened is that when it was quote unquote restored, the restoration restored it back to the 19th century. So
Oh,
only that original little salt box building. So it's it's a very tiny house.
yes. And you can see how when you pass this house on Springs Fireplace Road, you can see how small it is.
It's a
And
very tiny house. And so the idea of it being restored in order to utilize it to be as a true resource for the community for learning and teaching about the history of this place and of this family and the Montaukett and so forth. The restoration really actually, in my opinion, precludes that use, because it doesn't even afford a place for an office, something that
yes,
would be able to use, somebody could work there and utilize it that way. And unfortunately, it's just not being opened by the town for any visitors, which that's an issue for me, because I think it needs to be given a program. So
yeah,
hopefully
I
that will
agree. I
happen.
mean, part of like the work that, for example, the East Hampton Historical Society does, all of those buildings, that
Yes.
where
Yes.
accessible to the public, and really creates uh, a visual history of what this place once was. I mean, this is every bit the history of what this place
Absolutely.
was.
Oh,
And,
absolutely. Yes.
looking at a quote here from then town planning director Marguerite Wolfson. Now, this is from an article from a few years back from the East Hampton Star, like how,
Yeah.
she says history tends to record, and this is a blanket statement that certainly holds true. History tends to record the wealthy and powerful. George Fowler was neither, and we have much less information about the ordinary and poorer people in our history. And that really says it all. I mean, I'd love to go in and see what that house was. It would tell a story of the Fowlers and of Freetown.
Yeah. It
So
does. It truly does. I mean, just, and as you know, I've been involved with the Wainscott Heritage Project, and
right.
similarly, we saved the little house on
Yes.
Wainscott Hollow Road. And I had one person say, well, how could anyone have lived in that? It's like 200 square feet, if that. People did. people lived in very modestly, beyond modest. And this is, to continue what Marguerite Wolfson said, she said, yet the people who lived in Freetown were the workers who supported the wealthier households in East Hampton Village, Gardiner's Island, and elsewhere in town. I mean, that is vital because they're part of the fabric of the society throughout history. And we tend to elevate only the history of the, if you want to call it the elite or the wealthy or and when we say wealthy, we're not talking about, millionaires. We're talking about just people who had more.
Yes. Yes. And again, it's really, and she closed this, which I think is really a quote that really ties it all together beautifully. It's a potential interpretive tool for understanding the history of Freetown, which is minimally understood by historians.
Yeah, it really hasn't been explored. And that is hopefully something that will be addressed in coming months, years, hopefully not too long from now. But the fact is that, yes, we have historic districts in East Hampton, in Sag Harbor, in Southampton, that are interpretive tools for primarily the history of the colonists, the white colonists, and not so much the history of and credit to the historical societies for really, coming around and changing that narrative,
Yes.
reinterpreting, bringing to light things. And you mentioned the Plain Sight Project, which has been done so much to prod that on as well. But there's so much work to be done, so much still.
Yeah. And, but I mean, look, I think preserving that structure certainly was a step really in the right direction to do that. But, we should really start to wrap this up, Esperanza, but we also wanted to just touch briefly on really a place that's part of the Freetown community, Esperanza. It's located right in there, and we're talking about the neighborhood house, which I know was something you wanted to discuss in a little bit before we close this episode.
Well, yeah, it was like the chapel, like St. Matthew's Chapel and the Fowler House. Those, there are, as we have touched on already, few, as far as we know, structures that exist from the earlier periods of this area. And the neighborhood house is most definitely one of those buildings that has been integral to the history of Freetown since 1900, which is a lot of time.
Yes.
And I mean, the neighborhood house, and, you mentioned also Morris Park Lane earlier. We touched on the, sort of the boundaries of this area. And we're not even considering the fact that, people lived here. People also died here in that Freetown area. And so there are graves. And there's, as far as we know, I mean, there's more than one, but one that keeps standing out, it's right off Morris Park Lane, is the burial site of, I quote, Ned, faithful Negro manservant to Captain Jeremiah Osborne. So there is that, which the date of his death was August 8th, 1817. So, wow. I mean, how many more of these might there be? Because as years passed, buildings would be demolished, other homes built. The threat of development is always present. And in this area in particular, it has continually done so. I mean, more and more larger houses are being built even here.
And the fact that, again, to reiterate, it's a storyline that hasn't gotten the play it deserves.
Right.
And the attention, to your point, thank goodness for organizations like the Plain Sight Project that are bringing it to our attention. But
but going back to the neighborhood house also, I mean, that's just, I mean, we won't dwell on or go into detail about all of the history of that building, but gosh, in my entire life, that building has been there, and I've known of it as a community center. I have been to events there. I have, children, nephews that have gone to camp there. I know, Boy Scouts, all sorts of different organizations have utilized that building over the years. But it was just the history of it actually from 1900 on is fascinating, because it
Yes.
really was, it was a place where people could get medical attention, they could get food, they could get childcare, they could get marital advice. I mean, the list is endless of how that settlement house has functioned over the decades, to serve a dispossessed community, really. I mean, a community that really needed those services.
It was an underserved community being
Yeah.
certainly served by this, but it's again, it's really an extraordinary, like so many of the things we've talked about. It's just yet another extraordinary story to the fabric of what this place was.
Mhm.
And
And is to
it is, yes, thank you.
largely is. I don't want to dwell on what was, as because a lot of it continues. And I think the point that we try to make on Our Hamptons is, yes, we can look at things that have changed over time, because, as we say, we don't want to freeze time. It's not a museum. Things
Right.
evolve. There is a certain amount of continuity. The problem is when some people come in and really do just erase a history and think that it's enough to erect a plaque or,
Wow.
or
Yeah.
something like that. It just, like, to me, if you have something that is there existing, you preserve it. You don't just tear it down.
God. Yeah.
Right? So
Yes. Yes.
I include even,
History is more than a plaque, Esperanza.
it's so much more than a plaque. Plaques are
That's
wonderful. It's great, but that plaques are put up when something was lost, either by accident, it got burned down, or, there really was mindless, there wasn't the mindfulness. But when for a fact that you're going to be tearing something down and you think that it's enough to put up a plaque, is sad.
Freetown. Again, to our audience as we close this out, Allison McGovern, Reservation Long Island, tremendous amount of information written about it, probably by Allison, probably by Sara as well, now from the Southampton History Museum. And again, the Plain Sight Project, David Rattray and Donna Marie Barnes. To anyone in our audience really interested in delving a little bit deeper, and to Esperanza's point of the Long Island collection at the East Hampton Library, there's no
Yes,
shortage.
and Village Preservation Society
Yes,
also. I mean, there's great history through the Village Preservation Society that also is an organization that acknowledges preservation efforts throughout the village and the town. Um, you know, that's why I
and
say the continuity is there. The people are
absolutely,
there trying to
and
preserve all of
and
this.
and watch for events. There often are events, public dialogues between these organizations.
Yes, yes.
I've been to a few of them. I know you have as well. So we certainly encourage our audience.
Yeah, including, I would mention, the Farm Museum, which is another
Yes,
East Hampton town-owned property that is stewarded by the East Hampton Farm Museum organization at Prudence Carabine. That's a definitely grassroots or history
right.
organization.
Yes, and
Yeah,
Allison McGovern has spoken there. I know a couple of
exactly.
times.
Yes,
So,
yes,
yeah, so
exactly. And the
definitely,
Baptist Church, she's spoken there
yes.
as well, right? So we can't forget that side on Springs Fireplace,
Nope.
which has the Baptist Church, that community, is served by that Baptist Church, which also, incidentally, there's the Senior Center, which in our talks about, nightlife of the past, the East Hampton Town Senior Center building was once
Cottage Inn.
the Cottage Inn, a juke joint. I mean, honestly, it's just amazing, right? So much history everywhere.
Esperanza,
Thank you, Irwin.
As always, a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.